everybody. So today we got two short stories that hopefully are interesting to talk about. There's actually not a whole heck of a lot to say about them. I'm going to start off with an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. And as the discussion post kind of told you, he dies. And the whole entire escape takes place in a super quick instant as his neck is snapping. And before I get into the hints through the story that the escape is a fantasy, I want to actually talk a quick second about how this story is super ahead of its time. A lot of you guys described the escape as a fantasy or a hallucination, and I totally get that, and on some level it totally is. But what's actually going on, and like I said, this story is way ahead of its time, is something called subjective time versus objective time. And what that really means is subjective time, what's happening. Time is passing for the person experiencing it, the subject, at a different speed than it's happening for the outside objective observer. So what the entire escape and going back home, which in theory takes a long time, that's how Peyton experiences it, as taking a day or whatever. But in reality, the outside observer, it happens super quickly. And the reason that's ahead of its time is you actually see that in a lot of TV shows and movies nowadays. I'm sure a lot of you guys aren't Star Trek The Next Generation fans, but there's a really famous episode called Inner Light, in which Captain Picard is knocked unconscious, and as he's being knocked unconscious, he lives an entire lifetime in those few moments that he's being knocked unconscious. The other example that some of you might be familiar with, if you ever saw Black Mirror, there's an episode called Playtest, where a guy's like testing a video game and experiences a whole, almost like a whole lifetime, and the reality and the fantasy get blended, but it turns out that that whole experience was happening basically as he's dying. So, and this, if you want to get super scientific about it, this gets into this in a weird way. This almost like predicts relativity, because if you get into like Einstein's relativity, the faster you go and approach the speed of light, time slows down. So in theory, time travel, at least forward, is like sort of possible. But it gets into these warped perceptions of time that aren't really a thing until like the early 1900s, and this story was written 40-50 years before that, so it's really ahead of its time. Okay, that's the, and if you're a big fan of, if you're a movie fan, David Lynch plays with this all the time in his movies. All right, that being said, the hints with respect to the fact that the escape is a fantasy, most of you guys picked up on some of them, but if you look at them, I want to kind of like get all of them together and talk about them all at once, so you can see just how many of the hints there are that the escape never really happened. For my money, the biggest hint that the escape never really happens is Peyton's heightened senses. And some of you picked up, most of you picked up on some of the examples of heightened senses, but there are actually a ton. For example, you're told that he can notice the veins on each leaf, the dewdrops on each leaf, the insects on each leaf, and picks up on the minute movements of like dragonflies and mosquitoes and insects. He can see the eye of the sniper aiming at him through the scope on the gun. He experiences all of his like injuries and pains, which are obviously painful, in agonizing, excruciating intensity. He hears the ticking of his watch, and if you want to connect that back to Mask of the Red Death, the ticking of the clock could kind of be symbolic of his approaching death. Can you explain some of those away? You can explain the pain, like obviously he's in pain, but the level of detail that he's seeing, feeling, hearing, there's just no way. I mean, think about it. He's swimming in the water, escaping for his life. There's no way he's going to even be able to see from that distance the veins on a leaf. Like, think about how close you would have to be to see the veins on the leaf, each individual dewdrop, each flap of a mosquito or a dragonfly's wing. It's not possible. There's no way, even if you were just like casually strolling through a forest, you'd be able to necessarily pick up on those. Certainly not if you're desperately swimming for your life. And even on a functional level, if he was, let's just say he was close enough to a sniper to see the sniper's eye reverse through the scope, if he were that close, there's no way the sniper is going to miss, which brings me to the next hint that the escape is a fantasy. Military soldiers are aiming at him in the water, and they unleash a barrage of bullets, and they all miss? And the one that does hit him somehow manages to stop and lodge between his neck and his collar? The odds of that alone happening are minuscule. And like, yes, you can sort of argue that shooting into water distorts the trajectory of a bullet. There was a Mythbusters on that. But an entire, like, battalion that, first of all, they started laughing at him before, laughing at a botched escape, which is sort of ridiculous in its own right. There's no way all of them are going to miss. And then you finally get to, I don't know, the last bit of evidence that this entire escape is a fantasy. It's the walk home. And there's a lot that's not quite right with the walk home. First, the stars in the sky aren't in the right place. That should be a hint. And these people are, I mean, it's a clear sky. People 1860-ish were way more in tune with nature than we are now. The forest is untouched. In the middle of the Civil War, this Civil War was fueled by logs and timber being chopped down from forests. There was hunting going on in those woods to feed soldiers. There's no way a forest would be untouched. He covers 30 miles in a day, which oddly is the least implausible thing about what happens. As he's walking, he describes like the ground or the dirt as being diamonds and rubies and emeralds and gemstones. And yeah, I guess you could chalk that up to poetic license, but you could say, you'll see where I'm going with this in a second. He hears harps playing in the background. He sees a rosette light, which is a soft pink light, and some of you guys connected seeing a light with like a near-death experience, like that's what people claim to see if they experience something near death, or the whole walk away from the light, step away from the light. Well, the soft red light and the playing of harps, that's supposed to make you think of heaven. And is sand made of gemstones necessarily associated with heaven? No, not necessarily. But if you're imagining what heaven's going to be like, gemstones and diamonds and rubies all over the place, that's like that's something you could conceivably associate with heaven. He starts speaking in weird tongues on his walk home, and I guess to me, this is, in a series of implausible things on the walk home, this is like one of the most implausible. He either falls asleep or passes out from his injuries, and he still manages to walk and cover a good amount of time. And then he gets home, and he gets to see his wife. And it's described as like this long white walkway, and this always bothered me. Not bothered me, but always struck me as implausible. He's walking up the road, and his wife just happens to be there waiting for him at the exact moment he walks up. It seems like almost like symbolically he's arriving at heaven with the harp music, the soft light, seeing what he most wants to see, his wife waiting for him. I don't know if any of you ever saw the movie Gladiator. I know one of you did because you referenced it in your post, but that's kind of what happens when Maximus dies at the end. He arrives home and sees his dead wife and kid waiting for him. Granted, Peyton's wife isn't dead, but that's what he most wants to see. So, taking that stuff all together, the utter implausibility of his escape, let alone the people missing him and open firing him. Remember, this guy was not healthy enough, physically fit enough to join the real, actual army. But somehow he accomplishes the most amazing endurance escape run in the history of forever. The heightened senses, seeing in minute detail, hearing the ticking of the clock, experiencing every sensation in excruciating detail. Can you explain that away? Yeah, I guess adrenaline makes you super sharp and heightens your senses, but it doesn't make you Spider-Man and make you have these like ridiculously like zooming in on veins and bugs and dewdrops. No. And then the walk home, which obviously something weird about it because the constellations are in the right place and you're talking in tongues, but all those little hints and overtones of heaven, if you take that all together, it becomes pretty clear that, and obviously you find out that he's dead at the end, but those should be hints that something's not quite right. In the grand scheme of things, does this story have like a moral or point or message? I don't necessarily think so. I think Ambrose Bierce is very much in the vein of Edgar Allan Poe, that your story should create an effect or a feeling before they should teach. Some people want to say that this is an anti-war story. It's called An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, not an execution. Like the word occurrence makes this seem like a commonplace occurrence. And yes, people die in war. People die in combat. People die as prisoners of war. People die from infection on the battlefield. So you could, if you wanted to, you can maybe take away an anti-war message from the story. But I don't necessarily think that's the point of it. I think the point of it was to create a creepy, uneasy feeling by talking about a creepy, weird, otherworldly story. Like I said, when you take the fact that he's talking about this weird, out-of-body-ish experience and Ambrose Bierce like straight up disappeared, I always think that's kind of a weird synergy between like the author's life and the story that he wrote about. But that's An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge for you. If you look at my screen, I have the gentleman from Tiger King and a tiger up on my screen. And I think you guys can figure out the reason for that. It's because we're going to spend a hot minute talking about the lady or the tiger. And if you read my discussion feedback, there's one reason and one reason only I teach this story. And I actually teach it in a bunch of my classes. And it's to make a point about literature. Obviously, there's no right answer. You don't know whether the lady or the tiger came out at the end. In fact, you can make a compelling argument either way. Based on what you're told in the story, you can make a convincing argument that the lady comes out, and you can make a convincing argument that the tiger comes out. But, and we'll get to the breakdown of the numbers in a minute, all of you guys had an opinion. All of you guys had an opinion as to whether the lady or the tiger came out. So, given the fact that you have equal evidence for both arguments, what determined your opinion? What determined what you thought? And the reason I teach the story, and the reason I'm all about the story, is because it proves a truth about literature. That a lot of the times, like 99% of the time, what you take, I'm not even just literature, what you take out of a song, a story, a movie, whatever, is based on what you bring to it. In other words, whether you thought the lady or the tiger came out in large part was based on your own emotions, your own psychology, your own feelings, your own history, your own biases, your own life experience. You're based on you. And that's true of a lot of literature. That's why I'm not one of these professors who thinks that there's one and only one interpretation of literature. Is there usually something that the author had in mind? Yeah, absolutely. But if you take something away from it, that's valid because it's based on what you bring to the story. I think I might have mentioned that I like writing short stories. That's part of the reason I'm doing a short story class. I once accidentally wrote a ghost story. I wrote a story that I was super, super proud of. I gave it to one of my friends to read. My friend, honest to God, thought it was a ghost story based on his own biases, psychology, blah, blah, blah. And when I went back to read it with that in mind, I'm like, holy crap, I can totally see why you would think that's a ghost story. So that's the whole takeaway. That's the whole reason I wanted to do Lady and the Tiger with you guys, to make that point that a lot of literature is predicated on what you as the reader bring to it. What's going on in your own head, your own baggage, if you want to use that term, really colors and it really influences what you ultimately take away from the story. That being said, the reason the tiger is on the screen, and I did a quick tally of this as I was going through doing the feedback. 16 of you thought the tiger came out. 5 of you thought the lady came out. That is a 3-1 margin in favor of the tiger, which I guess on first glance seems kind of bleak, but believe it or not, I've taught this story in many classes. I've taught this story in at least 15, 20 classes. You guys had the highest amount of people voting for the lady than I have ever had in the history of teaching that story. Granted, 5 being the most ever is kind of like being the valedictorian of summer school. It's like, yes, you won, but 5. What does that say about... I don't know what that says. I mean, me personally, I'm thinking the tiger comes out. I honestly think the tiger comes out. But, like I said, if you think the lady comes out, that's predicated on your own thoughts and feelings and emotions and biases. And given that within the story, it doesn't lean one way or the other. Like, it really doesn't. Like, every detail in the story, you could spin and argue either way. So, ultimately, what decides what you thought is what's going on in your own head, your own heart, and your own soul. And that's the reason we did Lady and the Tiger. So that's pretty much it. It was just going to be a short little video today because there was really one and only one thing I wanted to talk about with each of those stories. Next time, we have 2 doozies of a story. Where I actually have a lot to say about it. The Lottery might be my favorite short story of all time, and A Good Man is hard to find. It's about a serial killer, and America has a weird obsession with serial killers, but we'll talk more about that in my next video. So thank you guys for checking it out. Thank you guys for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.